What's up, guys? I'm Uncorrupt, and I've got a confession to make. Recently, I got a little bit frustrated with the Hearthstone ladder, and I did that which must never be done. I started playing Control Warrior, and I thought to myself, if I'm going to be miserable while playing on the ladder, I'm going to make sure other people are miserable too. And so this is where we ended up. So I've been doing really well with the deck. I think I'm actually 22-9 since I started playing with it, so pretty solid win rate. I think that if you do the math on that, it's right about 71%. As I always say, that doesn't mean anything. Stats from, one individual person absolutely don't mean anything whatsoever. Sample size is way too small, and you really have to have multiple deck pilots in order to really be able to get a true expected win rate for a deck. But I have stats, so, I share stats. I've got the list up on my screen right here, as you can see. And one other thing that I wanted to get to before we really start to talk about the list is, raise your hand if you net deck. Now, if you're not raising your hand, you're lying to me, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Everybody net decks. It's the correct thing to do. And I don't know if there's still a stigma with net decking or if people feel some kind of way about it, but it's really the best thing to do. Everybody is just standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before him. We might as well admit it and own it. I'm a fan of net decking. I think it takes the game to a higher level when people are playing high quality decks, and then it's really not so much about somebody maybe stumbling into what's a really good deck, but it's more about the skill of the individuals that are piloting the deck. Now, the reason why I bring all this up is when you net deck, as I did with this particular Control Warrior deck, the deck could be a month old, it could be a couple of weeks old, it even could be only a couple of days old, but it might actually be just a little bit out of date. The archetype is fine, Control Warrior, but we might need to make some changes to the individual cards that are included in the deck. So I found this deck, I brought it over into Hearthstone, and then I started looking at it. And when I originally picked this deck, it wasn't running Mutinous. And I thought to myself, I want to try Mutinous. I think it could be good in the Ramp Druid matchup. If you could potentially hit a Kazakhstan somehow, that goes a long, long way towards winning you the game. Then, of course, things like Mozaki Mage, and a few other matchups where if you Mutinous and just happen to hit a certain minion, your chance to win just skyrockets. So it's been working out really well. I think I would say about 10% of my wins have been play Mutinous, and then my opponent insta-concedes. So if you remember what I said, I had 22 wins with the deck, so 10%, 10% is only about 2 wins, but hey, 2 wins is better than no wins. I do like Mutinous in the deck, but so I think originally there were 2 Corsair caches. I decided to take one of those out and play a Mutinous. The version before this, I actually had 2 Corsair caches, and I cut a Brawl to be able to fit in the Mutinous. Then I realized that I was kind of missing the Brawl. I wanted to put the Brawl back in, and so I decided to go with Mutinous. So I say all that to say, when you net deck, when you find a new deck, don't be afraid to tinker with it. If you change 1 or 2 cards, you're not going to break the deck. It's not going to ruin the win rate. But typically when you're changing cards like this or updating the deck, you're probably trying to target a specific matchup or a specific archetype where you want to get better. So it's like, hey, I want to be better against aggro, so I want to be able to run 2 Brawls. Or I'm trying to get a better matchup against Ramp Druid, so I'm going to run Mutinous. So whatever your goals are, don't be afraid to tinker with the deck. I think early on for me, I was kind of like, well, it's a deck, it works, this other person had great success with it, I don't want to change anything because I don't want to break it. But over time, as you get used to doing it, you can develop that skill set to be able to pick out, what cards need to change, because all of us are in our own kind of individual pocket meta, as they call it. What I face on the ladder is going to be different from what somebody else is facing on the ladder, even if we're roughly the same rank. And that's going to be true. Everybody has their own individual experience. So the person best qualified to tailor a deck to your needs is actually you. So don't be afraid to get in, play around with it, see what you need. Just don't do anything too awful drastic. But, again, if I was going to make some changes to this deck, I might say, okay, I don't really need sword and boards. I'm not fighting against a lot of aggro. I'm going to cut these. Maybe I feel like I want to try to fit more card draw in the deck. So, I could potentially cut those and maybe drop in a couple of slams into the deck. So I would still have the 2 damage if I need it. It does cost another mana, which could be important. But I have the potential to be able to draw more cards if I decide to run these. So again, just don't be afraid to play around with it. There's nothing wrong with that. You can develop an additional skill set, and you could potentially make the deck better against what you're seeing. So don't just blindly net deck. Again, as one thing that I like to say on the channel a lot is just make sure that you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's going to go a long way to helping you play better Hearthstone. Not only for you, but as a note to me as well, because sometimes I fall into that same trap of, oh wow, this is a great deck, I'm just going to play it as is. So we always want to open up the deck before we go out on the ladder and check and make sure that that's what we really need, what we really want. So digging into the deck just a little bit more here, you can see it's a pretty standard Control Warrior deck. There's going to be a lot of removal with things like Shield Slam. We have Onyxian Drakes that are also going to be good single target removal. Of course, we have Blade Storm. It's good single target. Could also be a board sweep style of removal. We're running Minefields. We're running Outrider Axes to be able to remove individual minions and possibly draw cards. Then, of course, we're running Ranker Brawl. So really all the defensive cards that you would expect to see in a Control Warrior, as well as our healing cards, which is going to come in the form of gaining armor, which are going to be things like Heavy Plate, Frozen Buckler, which also works as a Shield Shatter activator. Shield Shatter, again, just being another way to be able to sweep the board and clear minions off the board. So all of the defensive tools that are in here, and the thing that I would say about the defensive tools is this is a resource-based deck. Resources are what we have to spend, and we need to use those resources. So, you know, there's been a lot of times where I've used Shield Slam on a small minion, say on something like a oh man, I'm blowing it. A Neophyte. Cult Neophyte. There's been times where I've used a Shield Slam on this just to be able to get it off the board because I didn't want to take that 3 damage. I think a lot of times, or at least, again, just speaking for me personally, I think to myself, well, you know, Shield Slam or a Onyxian Drake, I'm going to save that for a big hit to remove, say, like an 8/8 that's on the board. You don't always have to do that. If this is the removal you have in your hand, we don't want to take a lot of unnecessary damage, because where you can potentially lose with this deck is if you take too much damage early and then, you know, your opponent is just able to finish you off before you can really establish yourself. So use your removals. You know, don't be afraid to use a Blade Storm on one big minion. For example, against Buff Paladin, if they land the Blessing of Authority, you know, Blade Storm is going to clear that up. Blade Storm cap was recently increased, I think, and some balance changes not too awful long ago. It used to cap, I think, at 30. It now caps at 50. So this will remove any individual minion that's on the board, unless there's just some type of ridiculous, maybe Yogg Saron that eats a lot of minions and just gets ridiculously huge. Bulwark of Azzinoth, another one of our defensive tools, prevents us from taking damage. Don't be afraid to just play this out. You know, if you're in a matchup, again, if it's like an aggro matchup, maybe you play this on turn 3 or turn 4 to buy yourself a turn or two to potentially draw into some of the other removal if you don't have removal. You know, there's no reason that you have to save this for the turn before you think your opponent has lethal. You don't want to save it and then die, and then you had this thing in your hand and, you know, you were floating mana for a bunch of turns before you died. There's nothing wrong with just playing this out. We want to use our resources to make sure that we don't take damage. Other cards, again, Frozen Buckler. Sometimes I'll just play this. If I have 2 extra mana and I know that I'm not going to need the 10 armor to be able to get the free Shield Shatter, maybe I just go ahead and spend 2 mana to play the Frozen Buckler if it's a matchup where I feel like I need more armor against aggro, or against maybe something like a Mozaki Mage, or even against like a Quest Hunter. Something where my opponent is going to really be aggressively pressuring my health total. If I don't need it for the board clear, again, Mozaki Mage, they're not really playing minions. Quest Hunter, they're not really playing minions. So I don't need to save the Frozen Buckler as an activator for Shield Shatter, because I'm really never going to be using this card. So spend your mana, use your resources. You know, Heavy Plate, a lot of times you're going to see this card traded. If you're in a matchup where you need the health, where you need the armor, just play the Heavy Plate. There's nothing wrong with it. Gain 8, spend 3 mana. Sometimes that's better than actually trading it into your deck. It's all going to depend on the game plan of your opponent and where you're at in the game. So again, you know, you're going to have to make sure that you understand the matchup and make sure that you understand what you're doing. But we have these resources. We want to use the resources. So the way this deck is going to win a lot of times is your opponent's just going to get frustrated and concede because they realize they're not going to be able to kill you, because we're going to be playing these cards. We're going to be removing their minions. They're not going to be able to attack us. And then we're also going to be gaining health through hero powers, things like Heavy Plate, so on and so forth. In matchups that are a little bit slower, at the top end of our deck here, you can see we have Kazakhstan, which is, of course, in my opinion, the strongest individual late-game card. And then we also have Raid Boss Onyxia. This can be used as removal. It also puts just a big minion and a lot of smaller minions on the board if your opponent can't deal with them. They likely lose in a turn or two. So as we go late, that's kind of going to be our game plan. I just feel with this deck, there's just so many matchups that I just feel like I'm so favored that I'm not going to lose. I don't really worry about aggro. I don't worry about buff paladin. Some of the matchups that can be a little bit more troublesome are Mozaki Mage. I don't see very many of those, but they are out there. You know, pretty much you're just hoping that your opponent messes up, or that they concede, or that they go off too early and they can't kill you, and then you can remove the Mozaki from the board. In that matchup particularly, you're probably going to want to save your Bulwark, and you're going to want to play it the turn before you think they're going to go off. And then that potentially delays them by 1, 2, maybe even 3 turns, because they're going to have to strip these charges off before they can go in. If you play a Bulwark of Azzinoth and your opponent goes in the next turn, they've either messed up or they're the best Mozaki Mage player in the world, because they were able to do some very, very quick math to realize they could break this and get through your really high health total, most likely in that matchup. The other matchup that's going to be really hard is Ramp Druid. Ramp Druids, if you can Mutinous the Kazakhazan, it goes a long way. Hitting Kazakhazan with Mutinous against Ramp Druid doesn't necessarily end the game, but it does go a long way towards ending the game. I had a matchup against a Ramp Druid where they were actually able to Solar Eclipse Resizing Pouch with 8 mana, and they were actually able to discover a second copy of Kazakhazan after I ate the first copy with Mutinous. So it was really, really good play by my opponent to be able to dig for those. And I actually did some math. I think it was something like 3 out of 14 8-drops that they could hit. And you know, they were able to hit that, you know, 21.5% there, assuming I calculated that correctly. But whatever the case may be, being able to land a Mutinous on Kazakhazan against Druid is going to be really big. I think now the playstyle has changed. When Druids are playing against Control Warrior, they're trying to play Kazakhazan as early as possible. And there's just so many treasures that are really, really good against Control Warrior. If they can hit like a Wax Rager, that can be bad. Canopic Jars with anything that makes a wide board, like you know, Boom Bots or potentially Bubba, that's going to have all the 1/1s that goes along with it. That could potentially be really troublesome. And even just Embers of Ragnaros with a Solar Eclipse, it puts out so much damage. It can just be really, really hard to beat Druids. When I'm playing against Druid, I'm trying to really get as much out of my deck as I possibly can. I don't want to play Kazakhazan early. I tend to hold it at least until my opponent plays theirs, so I can kind of get a feel for the treasures that they have, so I can kind of counterpick them with the treasures that I'm discovering from Kazakhazan. And sometimes, you know, just because the Druid plays Kazakhazan doesn't mean that they're going to win the match. It's not a guaranteed win by any means. First of all, they have to discover the appropriate treasures, and then they have to pick the appropriate treasures. If they're just going for, you know, maybe like Mutating Injection or removal, you know, that would be a mistake. You know, potentially we can remove boards with Brawl. If they have Boom Bots, we can potentially play a Rancor, remove those, gain a bunch of armor, and maybe come out health neutral. So it's not totally over, but we have to make sure that we draw into our resources before we play Kazakhazan, and then lose those resources in case we low roll. So against Ramp Druid, we want to draw our deck, have as many resources as possible to be able to fight back against the Druid. Sometimes you're just going to get rolled right out of the game. I think the matchup against Druid is probably 45% expected win rate for the Control Warrior, so we can expect to lose a little bit more than half, but again, potentially we can outplay our opponent. Potentially they can low roll on treasures, and that's how we're going to get the win there. And then I've never actually seen it personally, but potentially your opponent doesn't draw Kazakhazan, and maybe they don't draw Guff or anything else. That's certainly happened to me. I've never seen it happen to anybody that's playing against me, if you know what I'm saying. So that's pretty much the deck. The other thing that I would consider is, you know, against maybe a class like Ramp Druid, cutting class, you might potentially want to save this card. Everything depends on the situation in the game, what your health total is, what resources you have in hand, and the state of the game, the state of the board. But potentially you might want to save cutting class for after you play Kazakhazan, so that you'll be able to draw a couple of treasures with this card. Sometimes you have to play it because you need resources in your deck to be able to fight for the board, to be able to remove minions, so on and so forth. Sometimes you're better off saving it to be able to draw into the Kazakhazan treasure. So again, you just have to kind of understand where you're at in the game and what it's going to take to be able to win. But Control Warrior, it's been performing really well for me. I'm going to continue to play it, and I would encourage you to give it a try as well. It probably is a little bit more expensive when it comes to, you know, decks that are viable for the ladder. A lot of people call Control Warrior Wallet Warrior. There's really not a whole lot you can do about that. There's not going to be substitutions for things like the Nixie and Kazakhstan. There's not going to be a substitute for Rakara. There's not going to be a substitute for Bulwark of Azeroth. So Liz's a little bit more expensive, but if you can get the cards together to be able to play this deck, I've been having fun with it, and probably even more important than having fun is I feel like I've had a really good win rate with it. That's helping me climb the ladder, which is always my personal goal. Thank you for watching. Good luck out on the ladder. If you found this useful in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Please consider liking the video. Certainly would mean a lot to me. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.